this week, we're going to talk about cable face pulls, and specifically seated cable face pulls. And there are reasons why I am going to specify seated, but first what we're going to talk about is the actual attachment that we prefer to use. So I like using something like this. So 2 long individual straps allow for freedom of movement, long enough to actually create a nice ability to allow our shoulder blades to move independently. We're not gonna get jammed up. We're not gonna pull it right into our chin or into our neck or anything like that. These are preferable in most cases if you have something like this. You'll often also see people using something like a rope or something like a long strap attachment. So both of these, totally fine. If you have the preference, I would prefer something a little bit longer like this that you can actually hold on to. So if you can put your hands in here, hold on to a strap, same thing here, a handle, you're gonna be able to actually control and exert much more force long term rather than here. If you're holding on to a rope, your hand position is gonna be a little bit awkward and it just is a little bit uncomfortable, at least in my opinion, if you are moving any kind of weight. It just doesn't feel the best. So I prefer long straps like this. Now, we're going to go into seated versus traditional standing face pulls. So all the time, I'll see people performing face pulls. They're standing up. They're just, repping these out, just going, just looks amazing. I don't know. But the downside there is balance and stability. So the load here that I'm using is not nearly enough to really pull my body weight off its center, because I weigh 230-ish, so I have a nice base. But if I'm really actually performing this movement, let's say that I increase this all the way up to the full stack because I'm doing like a 12 to 15 rep set and I'm really, really pushing. Well, now all of a sudden I'm like trying to figure this out. Where's my balance? I'm kind of just like rowing myself up, changing my leverages as I'm going. Not super ideal. We don't want that. We don't want to have to do all of that nonsense just to create a balanced leveraged position for us to perform a movement. So instead, what's better and almost always more efficient is just sitting down on a bench. The reason for that is what we'll see here in a second is as we sit down on a bench, we're basically in the position that our body was trying to get into whenever we were doing those heavy standing face pulls. We're dropping our hips back. We have our feet out in front of us, creating a nice balanced, stable, and leveraged position for us to push back into the bench and keep our weight back. And we can perform our face pulls relatively problem-free. And now we can focus on the actual face pull motion. So seated, in my opinion, almost always better for anything that is gonna be in hypertrophy rep ranges. If you're just repping these out, 100 reps, you can do them standing, it's not a big deal, but I almost always recommend seated. And within that, you wanna make sure that the angle is sufficient to actually create the stimulus that we want and get that tension where we want it. For most face pulls, we're looking at rear delts, we're looking at mid-back, we're looking at mid-lower traps, rhomboids, all of the scapular retractors. So with that, it's often a little bit easier to hit those muscles if we have a slight downward angle. So if we're doing seated face pulls, that's gonna look like about a 45-degree downward angle. If we keep it at eye level, it's just gonna kind of feed into a weird rowing pattern. If we're pulling from up to down in that high to low fashion, it allows us to drive our elbows down in a more comfortable way, hit our mid-low back, mid-low traps there in a way that is very, very comfortable. It doesn't actually require any kind of jamming at the shoulder, which is always a problem for us. So as we're going through these movements, again, let's look at what we're doing here. So we have nice foundation, we're rowing in, and you'll note, even though it's called a face pull, kind of an oxymoron because we're not actually pulling at our face. What we're gonna be doing is pulling more at our collarbone, our upper chest, our neck, so that we can actually keep our upper arms and the cables in line. because we don't want to be pulling at a different force vector. So this actually allows us to transfer force very efficiently, keep our shoulders healthy, and not have to actually rotate at the shoulder to hit the muscles that we're looking to hit, which is again, our mid-low traps, rhomboids, and rear delts. And then some of the mistakes that we're gonna be seeing with cable face pulls, seated cable face pulls, are almost always going to be related to our arm path as it relates to the angle of the cable and how that force is being transferred. So really easy way of thinking about this is as we pull, we need to lead with our elbows, we need to lead with our upper arms, and our forearms here need to always be right in line with the cable. If they're not, let's say that we are performing some kind of rotation. So if we're rotating as we pull in, now our forearms are pointed up, but that cable is still pointed at the same direction. So that's gonna create a little bit of a conflict at our shoulder joint and our external rotators there, which is not what we're looking for with this movement. If we're looking for an external rotation component with the face pull, that actually needs to be specified with the intent, because otherwise we're really just looking at here at a higher angled row, horizontal row, which is gonna be, again, targeting our rear delts, mid-lower traps, rhomboids. So if you're performing face pulls with a normal intent with no external rotation, again, that's here, pulling it in like that, focusing on forearms and the cable angle. If we pull with external rotation, we're here, and we're really shearing at the shoulder joint just to pull it into our forehead, which is not what we want, again, especially with heavier loads. You can maybe get away with that with some lighter loads, like 30 rep max, but if you're going for 15, 12 rep maxes, that's gonna put a lot of stress on your shoulder joint. So another thing that we're gonna be looking at here is what are our shoulder blades doing? So because we are trying to target our mid-lower traps and our rhomboids, we're gonna need to focus on scapular protraction and retraction. So if we're locking our shoulder blades in retraction here, let's say, and we're just pulling, that's fine and dandy, but we're not actually allowing the muscles to go through their full range of motion and exert their actual functionality. Instead, what we need to focus on is reach, retract, reach, retract. And we're not actually getting any negative effects from that, because some people like to lock their shoulder blades in when they're only focusing on their rear delts, like they're trying to hyper isolate things. It doesn't really matter. Even if you unlock your shoulder blades, protract, retract, to get your mid-lower traps involved, you're still hitting your rear delts equally. They're still getting a lot of stimulus no matter what you're doing. Last thing we're gonna focus on here as a general mistake is getting too much torso and hip movement into the pattern. So if you're performing face pulls, it does not need to be a power face pull, right? So we're not performing a bent over row here. We don't need to do this. It doesn't need to be that excessive. So here, the most that you need to see is maybe a little bit of momentum kicked back into it, just to find the absolute perfect angle and feel. But in general, it needs to be a very strict movement, because again, this is meant to hit some of the smaller muscles of your upper back and your shoulder girdle. Does not need to be a massively powerful, explosive movement with a ton of extraneous motion involved like this. So keep it tight, keep it concise, target the rear delts, mid-low traps, rhomboids, all of that good stuff. And again, focus a lot on shoulder blade movement, protraction, retraction, and keep that angle absolutely locked in.